United States administration recently set conditions on their relations with Zimbabwe. Now, Chief, among the conditions is the amendment of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001 to Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Amendment Act of 2018. Good evening, and it is a welcome to this edition of Zimbabwe Today. My name is Admire Mungu. Now, what can one make of this recent development between Zimbabwe and the United States? How sincere are the United States in the raft of measures put forth for Zimbabwe? Is this going to have any effect on the playing field of the much anticipated harmonized elections that Zimbabwe will be holding later this year? Now, to discuss this and other related issues, we have invited to the studio Mr. Richard Mahomva. He is a political analyst. Richard, it's good to have you on Zimbabwe Today.
My pleasure to be here as well.
Definitely. Also, we've also made sure that the director of Election Resource Center, that is Mr. Tawanda Chimini, also joins us for this special discussion. It's good to have you on Zimbabwe Today.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
Definitely. Getting straight into it, I'm starting with you, Richard. What do you make of the Zimbabwe-United States relations in the context of the change that has happened in the administration of Zimbabwe?
First and foremost, if we draw to context, we should be cognizant of the fact that the United States has been openly in support of the Eastwell Mugabe must go rhetoric. And now that Mugabe is gone, there is a reinvention of that particular rhetoric, which mainly targets the ruling party. So I see it as a direct target on the ruling party because as it stands, the United States has taken a position to support the movement for democratic change in the sense that the amendments that we see in the Us-Zidera document, the 2018 edition, speaks to issues of reform, speaks to issues of destabilizing the establishment as propagated by the movement for democratic over the year. So it transcends the mere national notions, but I see it as a proactive partisan attack to the polity of Zimbabwe.
Do we see a shift in terms of the relations between the two countries? Can we say what are the main divergency points between these two acts?
Basically, the first act entailed issues of punishing, of putting sanctions on Zimbabwe on the basis of mal-political administration. And you'd recall that Zimbabwe is now recalling for issues of re-engagement and all of that. So in this new context, really the only hammering point that can be there is to try and look at issues of election reform, which I strongly feel the government is articulately addressed as far as giving liberty to the civic society, as far as even giving open access to broadcast access. So at the end of the day, I strongly feel like this particular act assumes that there is no democracy. And because it assumes that there is no democracy and that we depend on their help, we then need them to set the conditions for our elections.
Tawanda, just getting to you in terms of,
in terms of what is outlined, I'll slightly differ from my colleague in terms of the interpretation of what is placed on the table. When you look at what is contained in the amendment, they specific to election issues, they specifically focus on 6 things. They focus on voter registration and the voters' role. They focus on the election commission. They focus on the role of the military in terms of our elections. They focus on international and domestic observers. They focus on access to the state media by political parties. They focus on CSO's access to scrutiny around the election process.
When you mean focus, you're saying they demand change in those issues.
They do make mention of those issues. I'm not sure about the relationship that exists between the government of Zimbabwe and the government of the US. But in terms of what they articulate in the document, and specific to election, they look at these 6 things. Now, the point relating to just these 6 things alone is that these are not unique. These 6 things are, number one, consistent with the provision of our own constitution. So our own rules for an election context, as defined by the constitution, are articulated in the document, notwithstanding the background relating to the document. Number 2, they are consistent with the provisions of our own electoral act. Number 3, they are consistent with the SADC principles and guidelines, which we are signatory to. Number 4, they are consistent with the African Charter on democracy and elections. So the argument to suggest that this has a partisan context may be given. I think that's a political discussion that can be held. But specific to the technical issues pertaining to our elections, and given the fact that we're 4 months before the next election, these are crucial elements that we cannot ignore.
One of the conditions that the Americans, you did say that they did demand in terms of electoral issues when it comes to the electoral body itself. And they talked about Zimbabwe setting up an independent electoral body. And before I come back to you, Mr. Richard, in terms of Zimbabwe having an electoral body, is it independent? Is it not independent?
First and foremost, it is independent, and its existence is in line with the constitutional dictates. But however, we also need to go back to context and say, what are the constitutional justifications of the existence of this electoral body? This constitution speaks of an electoral body that was conceived through COPAC. And for Americans to then come on board and spell out that we need to have an independent body, it assumes that really our electoral body is not independent. And for crying out loud, where in the world have you seen a country enacting an act towards or against another country? That on its own is out of the framework of the United Nations. And being out of the framework of the United Nations, it means that it is an absolute undermine to global principles of democracy in global policy making.
Yeah, in terms of the question of the independence of the Election Commission, I would agree that the current Electoral Commission is a product of the Constitution. But there are questions being raised around the independence of that same commission, not just on the basis of appointment, which is where the focus is, but on the basis of operation. So when you look at what the Constitution says around the independence of the Election Commission, it's quite explicit. It states that the Election Commission must not be influenced by anyone. But if you come to our Electoral Act, which is where the independence of the Commission is being undermined, there are clear provisions. In fact, there are about 6 instances where our Electoral Act explicitly subordinates the Election Commission to the executive via the Ministry of Justice. And that in itself, in terms of the preparation for a credible election, which our own president has asserted, we have challenges. We cannot have a credible election when we have an Electoral Act that subordinates an independent election commission to the executive. So it's specific to the question of the election commission itself. This is a crucial element that we must address. Have we made sure that the Electoral Act is consistent with our own constitution?
I'll be coming back to you, Tawanda, when we do come back in terms of the fact that should we allow any sovereign country, because we are a sovereign country, should we allow another country to dictate terms in terms of how we handle our own elections? This is Zimbabwe Today, and thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure that you don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break. Joining us tonight, or rather today, is Mr. Richard Mahomva. He's a political analyst, as well as Mr. Tawanda Chimini, the director of the Election Resource Center. And just coming back to you, Richard, in terms of Zimbabwe, you see the US is calling for a free, fair and credible elections for Zimbabwe. This is just one of the conditions that is set by the U.S. in order for the U.S. to embrace President Mnangagwa's administration. What generally is the interest of the U.S. in Zimbabwe's relations?
The interests of the United States are quite clear because if you recall, just in recently, we had a situation whereby the leaders of the MDC alliance went to submit their requests to the Congress, to the United States Congress. And the particular demands that they were making to the architecture of democracy as we approach the elections were quite clear, and we see that this particular amendment is actually an extension of the issues that they posed. So the question, the answer to that question is that the United States interests are quite sectorial. They are not aligned to the common cause of the Zimbabweans and the common interests of all this, the broad interests of the Zimbabwean political space. But rather, they have taken a side. And the question is, why have they taken a side to support the opposition? It is because Britain is coming forth and it's warming up to Zimbabwe's changed political trajectory. China is one of the principal global economies is warming up to Zimbabwe's demands. So we are seeing a situation whereby geopolitics is coming into play, but as it is coming into play, we are seeing a situation whereby the Americans are continuing to cure their 2013 demise, because you should recall that they reached a point that their funding to civic society and all these other initiatives fatigued after the collapse of Tsvangirai through ZANU-PF's victory in 2013. So they have taken a side.
Tawanda?
No, I cannot speak as an authority around the relationship that exists between our own administration and the U.S. Administration. I think that is a bilateral arrangement, and I'm not privy to what could be driving this. But I would just come back to say, look, everybody who has shown an interest in what Zimbabwe is doing, especially with the coming in of the new administration, has insisted on one thing and one thing alone. They have insisted on an election that is beyond dispute, because that is good for investment. So specific to elections, the conversations around free, fair, and credible elections were contained in the inauguration speech of our own president. And defining freeness, fairness, and credibility is something that is contained, number one, like I said, in our own constitution. Number two, in the Electoral Act, which needs amendment. Number three, in the SADC principles and guidelines. Number four, in terms of the African Charter. Now, when you look at all those documents,
but these are processes that have been allowed to happen. These are processes that will be allowed to happen. You look at what the president has said in terms of there are certain electoral amendments that will happen.
Definitely.
And certainly, but then why do we now get an instance where a foreign country then tries to dictate? Isn't this a case of carrot and stick?
No, like I said, I cannot speak on behalf of the U.S. government and what their intentions are, but specific to the issues that they've raised on the table, what I can talk about is their relevance to our current context. I think if the president has already indicated that he would want to see a free, fair, and credible election, the question that we should be asking ourselves is, are these conditions necessary for us to have a credible election? And where we say they are not necessary, then we can have a conversation.
But as a country, are we not in the process of that? That was the question.
No. As a country, I think we have been in a process towards this. As far back as 2014, we talked about the need for the alignment of the Electoral Act to the Constitution. 3 years down the line, sadly, we have not concluded that process. So it is one thing to be in a process to doing something, but you must understand, for you to deal with election issues, a lot of the things that you have to do to prepare for elections are time-bound. If you do them as close to an election as possible, that will not contribute to an improved credibility, freeness, and fairness of that election. So the insistence here is that is not necessarily whether we're not in line to doing this, but to say if these issues have been raised, is there a question that we must raise as ourselves, as Zimbabweans, to say, what have we done towards this? And if we can't answer those questions, then clearly there's something that we need to do. Where in terms of the 6 issues that have been laid on the table, there is a clear need for Zimbabwe to urgently deal with these matters. And if the president is sincere that we need to have credible, free, and fair elections, these are not a problem, because they tie into the statements that he has put forward. He has said he wants to see free, fair, and credible elections, and everybody supporting this administration must work towards this.
Richard, do you agree with this sentiment?
My good colleague posits an important question, a very fundamental question, that are these conditions being set by the United States of America necessary? And my answer is a big no. Why? Because as it stands, the condition of civic society coming on board and executing its work, civic society is operational in Zimbabwe. There is no repression whatsoever. The question of access to the media, there is access to media, and something that has actually happened, contradicting the traditions of our past, has been a situation whereby we've seen opposition candidates coming on board on media, articulating their manifestos. We even saw the wide coverage of the late opposition leader's funeral and all of those aspects. So it speaks to a changed political culture. And as if that is not enough, the very same act, the Us-Zidera Act, speaks of national healing and reconciliation, and an act has been put by government. The president signed. It was one of the early issues that he enacted. And as if that is not enough, my good colleague refers to the president's speech and says the president has pronounced those issues. So the fact that he has pronounced those issues, it makes them a policy. And we do not need the United States to be telling us about how we should have peace and reconciliation, how we should not have violence. Why? Because their appreciation of the context of violence is selective. Because the context of violence can also be linked to issues of violence that have also been prevailing in MDC. We even saw that the people from the opposition failed to pay their last respects to their Democrat par excellence. There was violence at his funeral. Definitely. So to only narrow the context of violence to MDC, to ZANU-PF is problematic as part of the election conditions.
But one of the things that we must never do, especially when we're looking at a process that is pivotal to Zimbabwe moving forward, is to politicize the discourse around elections. I think we make the first mistake when we politicize conditions that allow for everyone, regardless of which political party they say.
From my understanding, diasporans outside Zimbabweans, Zimbabweans outside this country are allowed to vote. That's a question of no doubt. We'll take a break. We'll be back in the third and last segment. The program is Zimbabwe Today. We're discussing U.S.-Zim relations, specifically the Us-Zidera Amendment, and we have Mr. Richard Mahomba, is a political analyst, as well as Mr. Tawanda Chimini, the director of the Election Resource Center. Before we took a break, Tawanda, one of the conditions was that Zimbabwe should allow Zimbabweans in the diaspora to vote. As far as I know, they are allowed to vote if they had registered.
This is the thing. I mean, the right to vote is conditional. You have to have had access for you to register to vote. Now, we've had a process of registration of voters since September. And over the last 3 years, the Election Resource Center has been piling pressure on the executive to say, look, they need to consider the question of the diaspora vote. I would agree with you, the diaspora vote does exist in Zimbabwe. But here's the problem. It exists, selectively. And I'll explain. If you're on government business and you're in the diaspora, you have your right to vote, not only for the presidential election, but every other election that happens. As long as it happens in your constituency ward, and now with the changed electoral framework, at the level of the polling station, you can vote. But sadly, Zimbabweans who are not employed by government in the diaspora do not exercise the same right to vote. This is why there's a court case currently.
I understand they can vote if they do register. If they come back and register.
See, but this is the problem. Diaspora voting must not be confined to saying you have to come back here to vote. Why must I come back here to vote if I'm a citizen of Zimbabwe and I'm 18 years old? So that's where the problem is. And unfortunately, when we try to interpret this, the impression that is created is that it is such a costly exercise, we cannot afford it. In fact, our own president has said the real challenge is now administrative. It's not even the
Take us
question
through
of
case
the law.
studies. I mean, you're a fundi in terms of
Yes,
elections.
the diaspora vote exists across SADC, where South Africans in the diaspora have now been extended the right to vote. South Africans, I mean Mozambicans in the
This
diaspora.
is just recently.
It has, but Mozambicans vote, if you are in Harare along Herbert Chitepo at their embassy, Mozambicans in the diaspora go there and they vote. Most recently, Russians who were voting at their embassy. And there was an advert that was put out in the paper to say, if you're Russian, you have a right to vote, you come to our embassy, you can vote. So there's nothing that stops us as Zimbabweans, especially if you consider the fact that our independence was a product of a liberation struggle that pushed for one man, one vote. Why must we say that one man, one vote must be removed? Because one Zimbabwean who's contributing to the fiscus through remittances and is now resident elsewhere, but remains a Zimbabwean citizen, cannot exercise the same right. This is where the issue is. So the diaspora vote must be beyond context. And I would appreciate if the argument was reduced to saying we probably need to work at ensuring that we plan for this, because it's not something that you can do over a short period of time. But the interest at the end of the day, and this is us Zimbabweans speaking, the interest at the end of the day is that I should enjoy the same right as a citizen as my brother who's in the UK. He is a Zimbabwean, he's above 18 years old, he's not necessarily employed by government, but he should have the right to vote. And administering that right must be administratively prepared for. And there are instances, like I've said, they can vote via post.
I'll just allow Richard here to weigh in terms of, you talked about it not being a political issue. Is this not a political issue between Zimbabwe and the US, and they are dictating to us in terms of how we should behave?
First and foremost, this is political by the very essence that it speaks to issues of power. But most importantly, the problem that emerges is that as pronouncements to democracy are being made, if really issues of bringing about recovering the political space in Zimbabwe is grounded on genuine concerns. The Americans were already a mature democracy during the era of Rhodesia. Why didn't they enact a similar act that was directed on Rhodesia if there is specific interests or special interests about our country? So the fact that you then impose an act to a country that is independent, to me speaks of a situation whereby you are saying when self-determination is white, the Rhodesian kind of self-determination, you say when self-determination is white, it is correct. But when self-determination becomes black and we say we want our land and we say we want to consolidate the gains of our liberation struggle by giving more veterans their compensation, you then put in an act and say we are not doing issues well, forgetting that you are the very same people that initiated a situation whereby we found ourselves drowning in Issa. Selectively omitting a situation whereby for the pre-existing conditions of the land question to be in place, you were a guarantor of the process. And you ignore all of that and say, simple because you are giving land back to your people, you are asserting self-determination. The moment self-determination becomes black, then it becomes... So the whole concept really becomes lost in the entire process. So we need to look at all those issues in context, not to just look at it from the amendments that are coming in
One of the conditions, Tawanda, is that government releases without cost to all registered political parties print and digital biometric voters registration roll. Now, availing of print and digital biometric voters roll to political parties, what does this have to do with the credibility of elections?
Now, I'll just jump to what the African Union said about our elections in 2013 and what the SADC said about our elections and their credibility. They clearly noted that the failure by the election body to share, to make available a copy of the roll undermined the credibility of that election process. Now, when you're looking at an election, the principal document of any election is the voters' roll. If you are running, for an office at a church group, you definitely want to know who the voters are. Definitely. I mean, it's one of the
which is something that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is doing and availing.
They are working on it.
Or availing the print document.
They are working on it. They are working on it in terms of the law. It's actually provided that it should be provided.
Then
but even in instances in the past what the law provides for has not necessarily translated into what has been done. So specific to this particular demand relating to the availing of an electronic copy of the roll is the fact that not only must it be said to be done, but it must be seen to be done. And our issue, and we've raised this formally with the president, is that if we are going to be looking at a credible election process, one of the things that the president and his administration must do is to eliminate instances where the credibility of our elections has been in the past contested or is most likely to be contested on. And when you look at the 6 things that are noted here, I think having a frank conversation with anybody who has been tracking elections, you will agree that the credibility of our elections by our own African brothers who peer reviewed our work through international observer missions that are sent in here, they have raised these issues. And it's only proper for us to say, since our brothers have said it, it's an African discussion, why can't we then do it? If our African brothers said we must share as a standard on the continent, because we see it happening on the continent. I've looked at over the last 6 months, almost 5-6 elections on the continent. It's standard to make sure that everyone contesting the election has
I'll
access
give
to the
Richard
voters' roll.
an opportunity to respond on that.
My good colleague speaks of good standards of
African standards.
Yeah, African standards of observing elections. If we've got African standards, why then do we need a country that is not in Africa detecting to us how we should be behaving? This is where my problem stands, to say, why should we have a country that is not even African coming to meddle on issues that are African?
One question is the sincerity of the United States.
The sincerity is quite questionable because the United States has already taken a template of what the opposition has always peddled as quests for reforms,
But
electoral reforms, and it is clear.
What is stated
and that
here
makes
is
it
not
becomes partisan.
But what is stated here is not what it's not the opposition that said this. This is what the African
then
Union
takes
said.
analytical
This
ability.
is what SADC said. So if
But it is wrong.
the opposition regurgitates what SADC and the AU has said, and the opposition fortunately happens to be Zimbabwean in nature, are Zimbabweans not entitled to demand of the same? So there's another question to say, is it proper for a foreign government to impose such conditions on a country such as Zimbabwe?
It has never been done. It's out of the framework of the United Nations.
No, definitely.
It's out of the framework of the United Nations. And so where does that situate United States as a big brother to how we ought to govern ourselves as a people?
I cannot speak on behalf of the US
No,
government,
but this is
I
the
will
condition
state
that they are putting
they have
across
put in
to us
conditions,
as a
and
people.
conditions are about an intergovernmental relationship. And as a sovereign state, I am sure Zimbabwe is at liberty to say, we see your conditions, but no thanks, because we are a sovereign
this
country.
is the position that ought to be taken.
Yes, definitely. I think if the
Which
Zimbabwean
is
government,
in tandem with our sovereign interests
if
as
the
a
Zimbabwean
people.
government feels that these conditions are unrealistic, they're bad, just like in any arrangement, because these are business arrangements. I am sure when the US came here,
But you have
they
to
had
be
a
suspicious
delegation.
in one way or the other, Tawanda, in terms of you look at these conditions and the way they're putting them from, and also the fact that we've also seen some members of our political parties actually canvassing for these things within the United States Senate.
No, we have definitely seen that, and I think Zimbabweans are at liberty
And
to
yet you say it's not
engage.
political.
No, I've said let's not politicize the conditions themselves. I'm not talking about the context. The conditions themselves are conditions that are in sync with our own statute. They're in sync with the constitutional provisions, and we cannot dispute that. And like I mentioned, we can go blow by blow, each of the 6 elements, and say to ourselves, if we continue on this path, where the voters' roll, it's not yet clear whether it will be made available. We're still talking to the Election Commission around that.
Tawanda, I'll give you 30 seconds from now just to have your final conclusions in terms of your final remarks.
I think at the end of the day, the president has made it clear that he is in full support of credible, free and fair elections. And it is up to the president and this establishment in Zimbabwe to make sure that they begin taking the necessary steps to see a credible, free and fair election beyond just talking about it as something that is on our wish list.
Richard, last 30 seconds.
My submission is that any democracy is supposed to define its path to issues of constitutional architecture, but it is not legitimate for any state to make pronouncements towards another state or against another state because that on its own is against the framework of the United Nations. And again, as a last point of intervention, I think the African Union made it clear that our elections were quite credible. But however, it can always emerge as an alternative point of thought to say insinuations on credibility or not are a defining point of SADC and the AU's position, but we ought to define our destiny and our position as a people and as a continent.
Richard Mahomba, a political analyst, thank you so much for joining us here on Zimbabwe Today.
Pleasure.
Also, Mr. Tawanda Chimini, the Director of Election Resource Center, thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you for having me.
My name is Maya Mungu. Enjoy your viewing.